In Britain, our government has proved incapable of expelling clerics who preach violence and subversion against the state. Holland and Denmark can find no way of booting out imams who incite murder and the overthrow of the government, and have indeed in many cases proven track records of graduates leaving for careers in Afghan caves. And of course, in Britain only last month, the Home Secretary was once again forbidden by the law courts to expel a group of Afghan men who are only in Britain because they arrived a few years ago illegally on a plane. This wasn't any old illegality, though. No mere passport flushing on the BA loo for these guys. They arrived in Britain on a plane they hijacked themselves. And for all the guns, terrorism, and terrorized innocents involved, the British state, after many years, can still find no reason or any way to violate the human rights of hijackers by asking them to leave the country. The societies which can find no rational reason why they should not be destroyed will be destroyed, and free people who can find no way to understand what makes them superior to terrorists will find the march of history going not in their direction, but in the direction of their enemies. It isn't a clear road, of course, and among the throng are plenty of glad fools paving the way. Foremost among them today are those who claim that there is no enemy of Western civilization, or that to make such a claim is an unacceptable value judgment. Or there are those who say we cannot criticize another group because our ancestors did bad things. This is now an overwhelming arrogance of my generation, far exceeding the arrogance, I believe, even of their imperialist forebears. Those whose belief in preemption runs only to preemptive apology are now messing with people's lives, and it suddenly stopped looking cute. I lost count in the run-up to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq of the number of times Europeans and Americans told me that we, such people incidentally only ever acknowledge collective feeling when it comes to collective guilt, that we had no right to fight Al-Qaeda because we created them, or had no right to overthrow Saddam Hussein because we had supported him. Put aside for a moment, if you will, the historical ignorance of these claims, and focus for a moment on why someone would make such a claim. Is it seriousness, or is it simply posing at seriousness? Is it an expression of moral maturity or of moral cowardice? I would argue it's an expression of the latter. Only a generation brought up on a diet of self-esteem and ignorance could so continually parade under the not in my name inanities of the anti-war left, in which immersion in activism is actually an opt-out from action, where you never have to deal with a tyrant or genocide, because if you glance around, you can pretty much always find someone from the West in the background who you can blame and claim makes action not only illegitimate, but, that terrible word, hypocritical. And of course, there's the prevailing presumption that choosing not to act is not itself a choice and a mode of action. So you don't want anything to happen to Mr. Ahmadinejad. So your conscience is clear? No. If you call for inaction, you're acquiescing in the acquisition of a bomb. You don't get out of the game, you just pretend to get out with your hands clean. People who think like that have got away with things for too long, and in my book I try to take the argument back to them. After all, who has more to apologize for? Someone who supports the difficult and costly overthrow of the Taliban and Saddam Hussein, or a so-called peace campaigner whose activities, if listened to, would have by now led to the subsuming of Kosovo into a greater Serbia after a successful genocide, the continued rule of Afghanistan by the Taliban, and in Iraq whose best hope for the future would be the succession of Uday Hussein. This isn't conscience, it's ignorance. Profound moral and mental ignorance masquerading as seriousness. And the self-blame parade doesn't end with young people taught only guilt about their collective past. We've fast-forwarded here at a remarkable pace. We have politicians here and in Europe determining that any hit against America or Europe must be not the fault of the bomber or the hijacker, but of something we did in the distant or dim recent past. Terrorism, they end up claiming, is caused by our reaction to terrorism. So if we stopped reacting or trying to deal with terrorism, apparently we wouldn't face it. I watched, incidentally, with awe on Thursday as John Edwards pronounced in a television interview that last week's UK-stopped terror attacks were almost certainly a reaction to British and American involvement in Iraq. It was, as ever, a shame that Mr. Edwards couldn't have stopped talking, because if he'd have laid off for even a few hours, he might have seen, though not necessarily learnt from, the news that one of the main suspects in the bomb plots converted and radicalized in 1998. That's before Iraq or 9/11. As so often, we learn more about Mr. Edwards from his comments than we do about anything else. But for my part, I'd like to point out here something that he and others will have missed. You see, 1998 is an interesting year to convert to radical Islam. A wave of British Muslims, including Omar Sheikh, the privileged LSE graduate from London who graduated to murdering the journalist Daniel Pearl, radicalized in the 90s because they felt that Western nations didn't do enough to stop the slaughter of their co-religionists in the Balkans that decade. Now, as it happens, I agree with them on this one, although I never took it out on American journalists or infidel Westerners, but that I'm not a member of the religion of peace. But I would like to suggest to you, and I wish Europeans and Americans could get this one a little better, I would like to suggest to you that if a group of people threaten to kill, murder and maim us when we do act, and threaten to kill, murder and maim us when we do not act, then that is a group of people we should not be listening to. The feelings of terrorists are evidently not a useful moral guide. But as I say, in the relativist soup, you've got to seize on what you can, even if the nearest thing is a phony grievance or a hardly disguised malevolence. Seizing on such claims is understandable for the lost, but we should consider the results of these fake benign ideas. Both the Islamists, who beat us up from the outside, and the John Edwardses, who erode us from the inside, have one consequence to their rotten or lazy thoughts, which is that they intend to render, or will end up accidentally rendering, the West incapable of action. And this overt and underlying pressure could not come at a worse time for the West or the global community. Over the last 3 years in particular, many gleeful commentators have declared that neoconservatism is over. Well, we've been here before. The same thing was declared, of course, in the Reagan years. And many of the presumptions and misunderstandings were as evident then as they are now. But let's look for a moment at what is being put forward to replace what has been, to only some extent accurately, described as the neoconservative project. The declaration that Iraq may be failing causes barely disguised glee among some opponents of the war. A number of the most prominent left-wing columnists in Britain and America have expressed open delight at the prospect of President Bush and Tony Blair being taught a lesson. Evidently, for such moral people, wishing the death of thousands of Iraqis is nothing besides giving Bush and Blair a bashing. At this stage, there is a branch of the left that is now subsumed by outright nihilism and support for violence. As Paul Berman charted in his recent brilliant book on Joschka Fischer, they have ended up coming right round the other way. And then there are those who have decided, for instance, that the election of Hamas or the tortuous negotiations over the new Iraqi government demonstrate that these foreigners aren't really keen on freedom, or don't really want to have a say in the running of their own countries. You hear this one from right and left now, and it is, and the word is one which has been so overused that I hardly ever use it, but it is an idea which is without any doubt one of the most genuinely racist ideas I know. The election of Hamas is a problem we have with Hamas, not a problem we have with democracy. Likewise, the painfully slow forming of the new government and continued civil unrest in Iraq does not demonstrate, as many are now claiming, that Saddam kept a lid on things. This phrase, I believe, will go down in history alongside Mussolini and his train timetabling arrangements for sheer unimaginative wickedness.